Hello and welcome to this week's edition of TRP News, brought to you by therationalprogressive.com and the United States Rational Progressive Party. I'm your host, James Andre. Thank you for joining me. Former longtime Massachusetts Congressman and liberal icon Barney Frank published an article last week in Politico titled "Why Progressives Shouldn't Support Bernie." Frank makes the assertion that Republicans fear an easy Clinton nomination while they are locked in a bitter, lengthy, ideologically charged series of primaries. He also says wishful thinking is no way to win the presidency, and there's no chance for Sanders to win a national election, and that a long primary campaign will only erode the benefit Democrats are now poised to reap from the Republicans' free-for-all. Sanders supporters have, of course, attacked and dismissed Frank. Many advocates of a Sanders nomination point to large crowds and make comparisons to Barack Obama in 2008. Of course, there's no legitimate comparison. At this stage in the 2008 race, the polls were far closer, with Clinton 33% and Barack Obama 22%, and she's more popular now than she was then. In 2008, there were also three frontrunners in the Democratic nomination process, including John Edwards. And in 2008, Obama had overwhelming support from African Americans. Sanders has no such constituency, not even progressives, many of whom currently support Clinton. The reality is that Sanders is running a distant second when it comes to current polling. The current Real Clear Politics polling average has Clinton ahead of Sanders by 40 points at 57.5% to 17.5%. This includes a CNN ORC poll completed last week that puts Clinton ahead by 37 points. This is despite ongoing smears and baseless characterizations of Clinton from the right and many so-called Bernie Sanders supporters. The latest being a ridiculous article out late Thursday last week in the New York Times claiming that Clinton would be the subject of a criminal investigation over her State Department email practices. The absurdity of the article was immediately clear to anyone familiar at all with the months of congressional and media investigations into Clinton's email use. After a revision or two, including watering down Clinton's connection to the story, the Times seems to be attempting to forget that the story ever happened. The reality is that Clinton has a clear liberal record, enjoys a broad level of support, polls well against all potential Republican candidates, and has experience with large corporations, the White House, the State Department, the United States Senate, and experience running a huge international nonprofit. You may be a fan or a supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders, but there is no way within reason to deny Clinton's experience and credentials. And finally, let's not forget, Senator Bernie Sanders is not even a member of the Democratic Party. In congressional news, Bernie Sanders has become the top member of the Democratic caucus on the Senate Budget Committee. However, lawmakers have expressed little confidence in his ability to help move Congress forward when it comes to the stalemate on budget and spending. Politico reports comments from both Democrat and Republican lawmakers along the lines of, "I think he's busy, that wouldn't be my choice," and one quote from a Democratic aide saying Sanders is unlikely to lead the talks. Quote, "His politics right now don't align with deal making. These things are labor intensive. You can't do a budget deal when you're campaigning." At the end of this week, the Highway Trust Fund, which pays to maintain the nation's highways, is expected to run out of money. The House passed a short-term extension of the highway and transit funding, but only through December 18th. Many lawmakers want to pay for a longer extension, as the last extension was just passed this past May. Last Thursday, Speaker of the House John Boehner said that Congress will likely have to pass a temporary funding bill in September to avoid a government shutdown. Current funding authorizations run out and will force a government shutdown on October 1st. Congress has the month of August off and doesn't return until after Labor Day, leaving a limited number of working days to avoid a shutdown. Funding legislation has been stalled by attempts to attach unrelated issues to the process. Republicans pulled bills in the House after Democrats attached an amendment restricting the display of the Confederate flag. Republicans criticized Democrats for attempting to obstruct the appropriations process. However, they have also been grinding their own axes by attempting to block funding for Planned Parenthood for a year. Republicans control both chambers of Congress, and their various proposed spending bills adhere to strict overall spending limits imposed in 2011, the so-called sequester, that Mr. Obama has already said he will not accept. One bill prohibits any federal money from being spent on the Affordable Care Act, and strict rules for for-profit universities would be reversed. Another funding bill would stop regulation of fracking, prohibit implementation of carbon emission standards, and block new clean water rules. Another bill would keep the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, from carrying out net neutrality regulation of the Internet. The White House has vowed to veto each of the dozen spending bills in the works, and Senate Democrats have pledged to filibuster before they can even reach the president. So this fall, when you hear Senator McConnell and Representative Boehner repeatedly decry Democrats' refusal to pass one of their many spending bills, realize that those bills contain legislation that is directly opposed to the president's policies. And those are bills that the Republicans know full well the president has promised to veto. And this week in the war against the Islamic State, Turkey has agreed to let the U.S. military and coalition forces use a key air base near the border with Syria to launch airstrikes. The agreement follows months of negotiations over the use of the Incirlik and other bases by the U.S.-led coalition. The agreement comes as Turkey finds itself drawn further into the conflict by a series of deadly incidents near Turkey's long border with Syria. Last Thursday, IS militants fired from Syrian territory at a Turkish military outpost, killing one Turkish soldier. And earlier in the week, a suicide bombing blamed on IS militants killed 32 people inside Turkey. Turkey has been criticized for its inability or unwillingness to halt the flow of foreign fighters and supplies across its 500-mile border. Now, ISIL violence has increasingly affected Turkey, and the country is straining from the impact of 1.5 million Syrian refugees. The Department of Defense reported that airstrikes, the U.S. Department of Defense, reported that airstrikes against ISIL continued again this past Saturday. Fighter bomber and remotely piloted aircraft conducted 13 airstrikes in Syria, destroying several tactical units, a command and control center, a towed artillery piece, and a mortar position, among other things. In Iraq, fighter attack, and remotely piloted aircraft conducted 20 airstrikes, hitting several tactical units, an IED factory, 2 tanks and 2 armored personnel carriers, as well as several buildings, structures, and a bridge, as well as 4 ISIL staging areas. The strikes were conducted as part of Operation Inherent Resolve, the operation to limit the ISIL terror group and the threat they pose in Iraq, Syria, and the wider international community. Coalition nations conducting airstrikes in Iraq include the United States, Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Jordan, and the Netherlands, as well as the United Kingdom. Coalition nations conducting airstrikes in Syria include the United States, Bahrain, Canada, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Also this past weekend, UK Prime Minister David Cameron has ordered officials to begin planning for a new intervention in Libya, which has become a haven for ISIL jihadists. Western security sources believe the country needs international help to defeat the Islamist threat. However, the collapse of the Libyan state after the overthrow of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 means that there is no national government in place to make a formal request for Britain and other Western nations to intervene. So here we have two glaring examples in Iraq and Libya where the United States intervention has led to destabilization that has allowed extremists not only a safe haven, but the resources of failed states. Those resources include not only cash and military supplies, but oil production infrastructure as well. An NBC News report out last week says that intelligence gathered from a U.S. raid in Syria details ISIS finances, revealing millions of dollars in oil wealth. Oil smuggling, much of it to Turkey, is a key source of income for ISIL. Turkey, who until a few days ago was reluctant to offer help to coalition forces in the fight against ISIL. Two U.S. counterterrorism officials now tell NBC News that the amount of money ISIL can earn from selling and smuggling oil and gas is roughly $8 to $10 million a month. Daniel Glazer, Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Terrorist Financing, said last Thursday that in a one-month period earlier in the year, ISIL made about $40 million off the sale of oil. $40 million in 1 month. A senior counterterrorism official said coalition airstrikes have reduced ISIL income from that $40 million monthly high point. Seizing money from Iraqi banks was also a huge windfall for ISIL. ISIL took control of the territory, and in particular, the bank vaults of the Bank of Iraq in Mosul and the two big state-owned banks in Mosul and 90 private banks. When you add all that up, the numbers come to $500 million and maybe $1 billion. And that's just in the bank vaults, said Glazer, the administration official. A counterterrorism official also told NBC News they're taking a beating. They're getting killed in high numbers. 40 to 90 a day are getting killed, and that's heavy losses, but they are still able to keep up the numbers. So we have a situation, we're making airstrikes, and we reported on this last week, last Saturday and the Saturday before, scores of airstrikes and successful airstrikes against ISIL operations, and many ISIL militants being killed. However, recruiting goes on, and we reported on that earlier as well. And you look at this situation where you have someone like Turkey who's reluctant to deal with this, having their own issues with Kurds, that you have 1.5 million Syrians displaced, and not only that, you have millions and millions of displaced people around the world for ISIS to recruit from. Not only recruit, but kidnap as well, threaten with death, and force it, basically conscript into service of the Islamic State. So while we are having successful military actions, ISIL is also having successful military actions and managing to maintain their numbers. Also last week, the House of Representatives voted down a bill requiring mandatory labeling of GMO foods and voted for a bill that would allow for voluntary labeling. The Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act that would set up a voluntary program for companies that want to disclose genetically modified ingredients. But the measure would also ban states such as Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut, which have passed GMO labeling laws, from putting them into practice. It would also allow the Food and Drug Administration to define the label natural to include genetically engineered material. Representative Jared Polis of Colorado, referring to the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, said, quote, "This legislation, which should be called the Deny Americans the Right to Know Act, or the DARK Act, represents a major threat to consumer information." Police used the acronym broadly adopted by opponents of the ban on GMO labeling. I do want to point out here that the adoption of these kinds of dismissive labels, like DARK Act, is not only counterproductive, it is a favorite tactic of the right-wing fringe. Opponents of GMO labeling, the GMO labeling ban, are not helping by making up names, and what you are actually doing is spreading misinformation. There are two bills regarding this matter, and now opponents have made up a third name, further confusing the issue and making it much more difficult for people to know where to show their support or their opposition. Supporters of labeling point out that 64 other countries require labeling of GMO foods, and that consumers have a right to know if their food is made with GMOs. As I have pointed out here in the past, opponents of labeling typically point to the track record of safety and attempt to reduce concerns of GMOs to wild-eyed fears of food products being unsafe. These opponents ignore the myriad other concerns about GMOs, including the production process and the homogenization of the food supply and the environment. Some are concerned that the herbicide glyphosate, which is widely used on genetically modified crops, is harmful to human health. Residues of the pesticide have been detected in foods, and a World Health Organization research unit earlier this year said glyphosate was probably cancer-causing for humans. In 2010, only 1.6% of new food and drink products made non-GMO labeling claims. In 2014, 10.2% of new products were launched with non-GMO claims. 1.6% to currently 10.2%. While the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act did pass the House, an equivalent measure has yet to be produced in the Senate. So far, there does not seem to be much interest in the Senate taking up the matter at all. The upcoming funding deadline on October 1st would appear to mean that we will not see more of this matter in Congress until next year. And finally, this week, several months ago, I told you about the story of Joan Cheever, the San Antonio, Texas woman who received a citation after feeding the homeless. The citation carried a possible $2,000 fine. Ms. Cheever vowed to fight the citation and to use the state's religious freedom law to do it. The operator of a charity called the Chow Train pleaded not guilty in municipal court. She asked for a jury trial and the court complied, setting her case for September 23rd of this year. The city had offered a plea deal which was rejected. 2 weeks ago, San Antonio dismissed the citation, saying, quote, "The city's food and mobile vending regulations do not address feeding the homeless," and in an effort to move forward with the larger discussion. The release also said that city staff is researching comparable cities' policies and national best practices on feeding the homeless and how those approaches could be implemented. Although Cheever is Happily surprised, the city dropped the charges against her. She said she will not be satisfied until the ordinance that prohibits individuals from feeding the homeless is repealed. Quote, "We are not going to stop our fight until every good Samaritan is protected," she said. According to city officials, they plan on hosting the Homeless Feeding Summit Tuesday, July 28th, to discuss the future of the ordinances. And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. Any questions or comments, you can use the comment section below the video. You can contact us in the remarks or in the description of the video. We have links and the email address. You can email us or follow one of those links to our Facebook page or our website, therationalprogressive.com. And you can catch us on Twitter as well. And once again, thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great week.